As we begin our program tonight, I would like to thank all of the sponsors and ask Adrian Soul Food Scholar Miller to come on screen. Adrian is an author, the executive director of the Colorado Council of Churches, and the Colorado Humanities board member. Please help me welcome Adrian Miller.
Thank you and good evening. My name is Adrian Miller, and I'm a member of the Colorado Humanities Board of Directors. Welcome to Talking About Race, the second in an ongoing series of programs to encourage understanding and discussion about the legacy of race and ethnicity in America, and how together we can make changes now for a more just future. Thank you to our sponsors, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Durango Herald, Ground Floor Media, and Center Table, Tate Law, Arapahoe Libraries, and the many community partners who are posting or streaming this program. A special thank you to Mike Ferrufino, president of the Colorado Hispanic Chamber of Commerce, and Jesus Carrillo for providing media production services. I'd also like to recognize the board and staff members on our Changing the Legacy of Race and Ethnicity Conversations for One America Committee, also known as CLOR. Paulette Tate, the committee chair, and especially Director of Programs Josephine Jones, Nora Ridgway, Christine Goff, and the Colorado Humanities Executive Director Maggie Colville for their commitment in delivering this important programming. Tonight, Dr. Rosemarie Allen will be our CLOR moderator. Dr. Allen is president and CEO of the Institute for Racial Equity and Excellence and a Metropolitan State University of Denver Associate Professor of Early Childhood Education. This evening's conversation aims to provide parents and caregivers with the skills to have discussions about race with their children and answer difficult questions at a pivotal time in our shared history. Please welcome Dr. Rosemarie Allen.
Thank you so much, Adrian. It is such an honor to be here. You know, the civil unrest that has taken place since the murder of George Floyd has prompted us to look at how we address issues of race and how we talk about race. You know that studies show that very few families talk about race, and those conversations are actually based on the race of the family. What we find is that African American families are 3 times more likely to talk about race, and Latinx families are 2 times more likely to talk about race than white families are. So we today are going to embark on this conversation to talk about the importance of talking about race and doing so very early in a child's life. And to help me have this conversation, I have 3 phenomenal panelists. The first is Dr. Alyssa Rauch. She is assistant research faculty at the University of Denver, and she works on projects that build systems of support for young children and their families. She is a mother and a learner and an amazing social justice warrior. Next, we have Dr. Dorothy Chaplin. Dorothy is a professor and teacher extraordinaire. I had the honor of meeting Dorothy when she was my own son's 1st through 3rd grade teacher. She serves as an assistant professor of early childhood and culturally and linguistically diverse education for MSU Denver, and she is passionate. She's a passionate advocate for equity and for trauma-informed practices. Next, I'd like to introduce you to Omar Montgomery. Omar is an educator and a community activist. He is also president of Aurora's NAACP, and he heads the African American Student Center at CU Denver. I've known Omar most of his life, and he has dedicated his life and his career to his community, to civil rights, social justice, and opportunity for all. So here is our esteemed panel, and we are ready to jump in to have these conversations. We welcome your questions and we welcome your input. So now we're going to start with our panel, and I'm going to ask questions and we're going to interact and have a conversation. So let's start with Dorothy. Dr. Chaplin, we've heard about the importance of talking to children about race. Tell us why this is important and how do we even start that conversation?
Well, the reason that it's important is because of child development, right? And where children start. So we know from a variety of studies that have been done that by 3 weeks of age, infants can see faces, right? And they start to identify their family members. By 3 months, children can categorize by race. In other words, in these studies, when they track where children look and they show them different faces, 3-month-olds prefer and gaze longer at faces of their own race than of others. So they're able to recognize and identify 3 months of age. By 6 months, children prefer to learn from their own race. That's their preference, unless they've been exposed to others. So if they're only surrounded by people of the same race, that's their preference, right? And that's a biological imperative, right? We feel safe within our own tribes, and within our own communities. That's something that's evolved in us to keep us safe, right? At 6 months of age, right? I prefer to be around people that I recognize as part of my own community. I don't feel threatened or afraid of them. By 9 months, we begin perceptual narrowing. And the studies that have been done on this are fascinating, because at 9 months of age, children are looking at different individuals, right? Different faces, and they more readily recognize and can sort between people within their own race. So people who have similar facial structures of their same race, they can identify. People of other races, they have a harder time distinguishing. So you know that they all look the same to me. That's actually a fact. It's a fact of a 9-month-old brain that I can't distinguish between this person's face and that person's face as well, because I have been exposed almost entirely to my own race. That is, perceptual narrowing can continue through your entire life unless it is reversed by exposure. By 3 years of age, children rank by race. And what's interesting, 3 years, right? So preschoolers. What's interesting about that particular point in time is that it's no longer based on my own race. I rank based on what I have been exposed to in society as a whole and in my life. So it's no longer my race is the preference. It is white. That's the preference. It's the dominant. It's what I've seen the most of. It's what I've been the most exposed to. And children's logic at 3 is starting to develop, but it's off, right? Their logic isn't accurate, right? A child at 3 will have a fit that it can't possibly be time for dinner because they didn't have their nap. And that's how their logic work. It's not that it's dinner time and you skipped your nap. It's really, no, there's an order of things. And that's how their logic develops. And their logic at 3 years of age tells them that what I see the most is the most preferred. So there are certain doll studies that have been done where children choose between which doll they want based on races, and which one is the prettier one, and which one is nicer, and which one is better. And children of all different races prefer the white doll over the black doll. And that has to do with all of this exposure and what we expose children to. So if we aren't teaching children to see and acknowledge race, we're teaching them these racist ideas of valuing one race over another. And it's essential that we think about this, because this is the development. This is child development from the earliest years.
Dorothy, you have touched on so much, even how us not talking about race impacts children of color, to where they prefer white dogs over their own race. I want to dig into that a little bit more. One of the things we talked about also was exposure. And exposure can help to eliminate some of these preferences for white dogs and for white people overall. You know, one of the things I said before this show started is that people of color talk to their children about race very, very early. So I'm wondering, Omar, At what age did your family talk about race? And at what age were you when this conversation first came up?
Wow. Since I can't remember, just to be honest, you know, first of all, I want to thank Colorado Humanities and our sponsors for having this event and talking about a very important subject. And Dr. Allen, thank you for moderating. And Dr. Allen, you know my family very well. You probably know the answer to this question better than me. But my father, well, first of all, I started with my grandmother. My grandmother gave me a historical perspective as to why race is important, coming from Vicksburg, Mississippi, and leaving Vicksburg, Mississippi. Part of the reason why she got sick of seeing strange fruit hanging from the tree. And for those who understand exactly what I'm talking about, we're talking about lynchings. We're talking about people like Emmett Till. We're talking about those we don't know their names. And for whatever reason, they were lynched, tortured, simply because of their race. My grandmother moved to California, one, because she wanted to vote and not be harassed about voting. And two, my grandmother was very resilient. And so she said, my kids will not be raised under the concept of Jim Crow. So my grandmother used to always tell us stories about what was going on in Mississippi. And just to be even blunt, she says, look, you have to be better than white America in order for you to survive in America. And if you're African American or a person of color, you probably heard that 1,000 times. My mother was just resilient in all ways and always said, Omar, please be careful. Make sure if you're being stopped by the police, have all your stuff available to you. If the school resource officers or the school police officers stop you, make sure you have your school ID. Back then, they were called truancy officers. And last but not least, my father, who taught me how to navigate and also fight against racism. And as a matter of fact, there's a funny story about Dr. Allen. One of my first protests that my father took me to, Dr. Allen was leading as a result of a police abuse case of a gentleman by the name of Ron Settles. So I was exposed to the activism part, the conversation part, and the historical part basically since birth. Dr. Allen, are you on mute?
You bring up so many amazing points. And I love the 3 levels of the conversation that you just had with us. I do want to highlight the idea of lynching and that strange fruit. And I want our listeners to go to the website and to Google the National Memorial for Peace and Justice. It is actually the Lynching Museum that was created by the Equal Justice Initiative, Brian Stevenson's work. And it's just amazing because I believe that so many African-American families have stories about lynchings. My son visited the museum and actually found my great uncle listed that was missing for years, and we had no idea where he was. And he called in tears and he said, I think I found our uncle. So those stories are real. And just like you said, these conversations start very, very early. Just how to be. Part of our conversations is how to be Black in America, how to leave a store and make sure you have a bag and a receipt, how to understand that you may be playing the same way that some of your white friends, and you may get in trouble and they won't. But what I love about what you said is not only did you have those conversations about how to keep yourself safe as a Black man, but your family didn't create a victim. They created a warrior so that you would have the tools that you needed to fight against this unjust system. And I want to hear more about that as we continue to go on. Now, Alyssa, as a white mother, when did you decide to talk to your children about race? And what was the impetus for that conversation?
Yes, thank you, Rosemarie, and to the other panelists and to Colorado Humanities for having this webinar. It's so important and it's so good for us all to be having this conversation. I think that knowing what I know now about what Dr. Chaplin shared around development and how early it happens, I started way too late with my children. And it was because I had perceptual narrowing and I didn't have the exposure that I needed. And it was once those things started happening for me that I began talking to my children. I remember the day that my son came home from kindergarten and was describing a young boy of color who he could hear in the classroom next door always getting yelled at. And it was one of those things where I knew I had to say something. And this was next to also a lot of the things that we were seeing in the media, Michael Brown and all of those. That is unfortunately when I started understanding this and having this own exposure in my own life. And I realized that not having these conversations with my children actually was a matter of life and death. If I didn't have these conversations with my white children, then there would be another generation that failed to protect Black and brown bodies. But if I had this conversation, if I started to talk about why they heard kids getting into trouble in the other room, or how children were identified based on their behavior and well known in the classroom, then I knew that is I could help to stop and dismantle some of the racism that's happening. And so that's why I started to have those conversations with my kids. And it started just with talking about fairness, right? It started with talking about, wow, how would it feel if if it were your name who everybody was coming home and saying to their parents, wow, this kid has a behavior plan, or this kid has. And so I started talking to them about that. And then we started talking about racism, because when you talk about race, you can start to talk about racism and you can start to talk about privilege. And we began to find that we were having these conversations at a young age, 5, 6, 7, around our own spiritual growth and wellness, around media, cartoons, and books that we were reading, movies that we saw on TV, my daughter's infatuation with Disney princesses. All of that led us to having these conversations. And I think ultimately, as I look back now, what that did was it helped to provide my kids with an understanding of our moral compass as a family, which was one that really is based in justice, what's fair and what's right.
I'm going to take Elmer Harris's comment here. And as we pull that up on the screen, Dr. Harris says, although you feel you started too late, it is never too late. And thank you for being an ally. And Alyssa, that's what we want to convey to parents. It's never too late to start actually where you are. And in making that decision that you're going to be a family that's really committed to justice. You know, we have a question that was put up when the participants registered, and it said, do we bring up the subject of race with children, or do we wait until a situation arises that allows us to address the topic? I'd like for you and Dr. Chaplin to answer that question.
Sure. I would definitely bring it up at as ever it can be available. There are constantly times where there's opportunities to have conversations. Like I said, it's in the media, it's everywhere, and so I think I would definitely begin to have those conversations. And I would start by asking questions and really helping children think about what is it help them to be curious about why things are presented to them the way that they are. And I keep going back to, again, Dr. Chaplin's ideas around development. And if we don't expose kids, then that perceptual narrowing continues. So whenever we can, and every opportunity that we can, I say I would be a proponent of discussing discussing issues of fairness and justice and racism.
Yeah, I would second all of that. And also second what Dr. Harris said about Alyssa. It's not too late. And what's important is that you start when you know something, right? So if you're watching this and this is the first time that you've started to think about this this idea, or you're a teacher and you've resisted this idea because you were raised to judge people by the content of their character and not by the color of their skin, right? An entire generation of people took that to mean, I don't see color. And so talking about color is taboo, and recognizing, identifying people by the color of their skin is something that we don't want to do for children, because we want them to just see people equally. Well, when we know that children as young as 3 months are seeing the differences between people based on their race, we can have this conversation as soon as we talk to children. And when they ask questions and when they notice things, to acknowledge it. The thought that we're protecting our children is a part of that we want to keep them innocent. Well, only some children get to be innocent of this, because others have to be protected by their families from living this in their lived experience. And our children aren't sheltered from this, right? They're in a classroom and they hear the child in the classroom next door being reprimanded loudly and harshly, and they know that that's a Black child who's being treated that way in that classroom. In your family, Alyssa, your child felt comfortable to bring that up and talk to you. So it wasn't something so taboo that they couldn't ask. And that's where we start, to just say, I'm learning these things myself. Don't wait until you know everything. Don't wait till your book club has finished reading all of the books on the list and having those private discussions before it comes to your children. Right away, to say, wow, I'm learning some things. I found out some things. I'm questioning some things that I didn't think about before. And how do you see this happening? Invite the conversation. I think in preschool, it is certainly not too young to talk with other people's children and just allow the conversation to be about skin color, to talk about the differences that we can easily and readily see between people, and extend that to, well, then what are the things that are the same and what are the things that are different and what do we know about people, rather than ignoring that one aspect of people that's such a clear aspect.
Yes. Oh, thank you so much, Dorothy. And while we all understand the importance of talking to children about race and starting very early, there are some out there who believe that by talking to children about race, you're actually promoting and reinforcing racism. Omar, what do you say about that?
I say that if you begin to look at the school to prison pipeline, if you begin to look at the underrepresentation in these programs and the overrepresentation in special ed, if you begin to look at jail populations according to your population in that particular area, the discrepancy, like if you're only 4% of a city, but make up over 50% of the jail population or the incarcerated, then race is in the statistics and how people are being treated. Kids know when they look at a TV program or when they look at different television shows or when they look at social media, the difference between how a person of color is treated and a white person. They can make that perception on their own. The question is, who is teaching them how to address either the trauma that comes with it or the possible impact it can have on them personally? So at that moment, you're teaching your child how to navigate a system that's been in place since we arrived here in 1619, from indentured servants to slavery, to black codes, to Jim Crow, to the prison industrial system. into now the structure of racism that is the benefactor of all those structures I just got through describing. So if we're not able to have an honest conversation about a race-based society, then we are in trouble. Because what's going to end up happening is you're going to have children who believe that things are equal for everyone. And kids are our brightest minds. They believe in the sandbox theory. And I don't know about y'all, this is my personal theory when I talk about race. Everybody in the sandbox just want to play. They want people with good attitudes. And if you, it may be video games now, but back then it was the sandbox. And kids didn't care about gender, race, or anything. They just want to know, are you there to have fun? It is the most innocent part of your life. Until that child see their father get stopped by a law enforcement officer, or get followed in the grocery store because they think they're trying to steal something, or get yelled at by a teacher time and time again to the point where it destroys that person's confidence in their academic skill. When they begin to witness that, we have to have those conversations at an extremely early age, regardless of the race of your child. Because one, we have to arm those childs that are the targets of racism so they know how to navigate, they know how to advocate for themselves, and they know how to lift themselves up when it's necessary. And then on the other side, we need for those who are benefactors of racism, and we have to call it what it is. Those who benefit from white privilege, those who benefit from the structure that is here today, for them to know the privilege that they have and how to use their voice to be an ally. So to me, these are things that we have to talk about daily. And that doesn't mean that we're promoting racism. If anything, we're doing everything in our power to dismantle it.
Oh, Omar, you touched on so much. And you're talking to early childhood people. So that sandbox analogy, it's very, very, very fitting. And everybody wants to come to play. And everyone wants to have a good time. And that is where they learn who's valued, who's not, who's disciplined, who's not, who's given the benefit of the doubt, who's not, who's represented, and who's not. I see a question here from Stephanie Milner, and she is in rural Colorado near a Native American reservation. And she's wondering, as we bring her question up, she's wondering how to create exposure. And all of you touched on that exposure. For instance, Omar, you talked about white privilege. And Dorothy, you talked about exposure and what children see. And I want you all to just think for a minute about Cinderella. And when you think about Cinderella, what race pops into your mind? So how do you get away from a white Cinderella in a classroom, in an environment, in a world where white children see themselves as princesses and children of color don't? You expose them to different books. For instance, here's a Cinderella story, and she's Black. Imagine reading this story and talking about a Black Cinderella. Here's another one, Adelita. This is a Mexican Cinderella story. So Stephanie, when you're trying to expose children, take them from what they know and then expand their reality so that they can understand that every child can be Cinderella. Dorothy, I saw your hand go up.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to that, right? In a preschool setting, to think about the things that we do, right? The things that we provide to children, the dress up and the play that they do, and to stretch ourselves to consider other perspectives and other ways. So you're going to have the dressing up and flower shop for the wedding and but the wedding dress up. If we only share materials, dress up clothes, and photos of a particular kind of wedding, we limit the exposure. So if children only see a big white fancy cake dress and that's what they dress up and that's how they play wedding, there's a particular cultural perspective that wedding represents, and it limits their exposure to other ways of celebrating a wedding. So the red silk Chinese marriage dress is a whole nother, so have that as a part of your dress up area, right? To stretch to other cultural and have photographs, pictures from actual pictures online of weddings from around the world that children can emulate and dress up and play. They are then being exposed. So even if you're not in a situation, in a surrounding where you can bring people into that setting where you're hiring people from all different races and cultures, as ideal as that might be for us, to think about how do we bring that in through books, through photographs, and through images and other ways that children can be exposed in a safe environment. I think all the time that we want to have children exposed to different disabilities as well in the classroom. So you might have a picture book with a child who's in a wheelchair in the picture that gives children, even if there are no children in the classroom who have a wheelchair, it gives children the opportunity to ask questions and to talk about, why is that child in a chair? What does that mean? How did that happen to them? In a safe way where you can have that conversation with them. The same thing is true when you have a picture of a wedding that looks nothing like what Cinderella's wedding in the traditional Cinderella story looked like, and what does that mean? And we can have that conversation in a safe environment. I say we as teachers can have that conversation and stretch our own understandings along with the children. Again, we don't have to know everything first, right? We don't have to have mastery of everything. And we don't have to have in our classroom only the cultures represented by the children in our classroom. They need, I see that in the comment, right? They need to see windows into other lives so that they have the opportunity to be exposed to other lives.
Absolutely. Dorothy, you just reminded me with the example about the wedding dress, even addressing gender. A friend of mine said his son came home and said, you know, Dad, I think I want to get married one day. I just don't know if I want to marry a girl or a boy. You know, even addressing the whole gender issue is going to be big. You know, Crystal, and I hope I'm pronouncing this right, Cisneros, as we bring her question up, she says, how do we talk to white parents about racism when they don't want their preschoolers to learn about it? How do we approach creating an anti-racist classroom when some white parents are hesitant? And Alyssa, I'd like you to answer that because you are very comfortable talking to your children, your family about race. And I'm wondering, as a white ally and social justice warrior, are you sometimes asked why you're taking this on? And how do you create comfort with other white families in having these discussions?
Yeah, I appreciate the question. And I'm going to be vulnerable with my answer, with all my answers tonight, because I believe in that. But I think that the problem that families are having about not wanting to talk about race is their own misunderstandings and their own fear of addressing their own personal beliefs, their own bias, their own privileges. And I think, honestly, that is how this gets perpetuated, right? I think that the more that we can do to support white parents in understanding why this is important, but also in understanding their own place in this, and not necessarily in an evaluative way, but the systems that they were raised in, the systems that made them who they are, who made them hesitant to do this. I think we can't be afraid to tackle those. I think that, I'll say honestly that growing up, I viewed people of color with pity, right? Oh, those poor Black people. I'm not the only woman in her mid-40s who grew up watching the show Cops, right? So I had all of these things that were there for me. I was an educator, and I believed that we were there that I could save children, right? I had that mentality of white savior for a really long time. I had to come to terms with that myself, and I had to understand those pieces. And I think, Crystal, there's certainly not an easy answer to your question, but I think it's when we come to understanding that systemic racism and white supremacy hurts everybody, right? This isn't good for anyone. As Omar talked about, these things are just, they are damaging to everybody. And so when we can start to see that, we need to come at this as a community together and realize how we can continue to grow and move forward, and how dismantling these systems and structures and institutions that have existed for so long really will support everything from our well-being to our economy to our criminal justice system. All of those things are beneficial when we can really start to dismantle white supremacy and address these pieces. And I think that might be something to say. I know that it's not for really young children, but Ben and Jerry's even has something on, how white supremacy is bad for everybody. And so it's in really terms that I think people can understand. And perhaps that would be one way to address it with adults.
Alyssa, I can't tell you how much I appreciate your vulnerability, because the reality is that we're all in different places on this journey, and we've all grown as a result of it. I often tell my students that this is a journey that you're on for which you never ever reach a destination, because once you think you're there, then you're really in trouble because there's no check and balance system. So we're all growing. And one of the things we talk about when we're talking to our students about talking about race is that we are not teaching white children, white families to pity or have sympathy for people of color. What we want more is empathy. And one of the registrants' questions says, I don't want to sugarcoat things for my kids, but I don't know how to approach really tough topics like police brutality without scaring them. What language about violence is appropriate for kids? So either any of you jump in. If we can talk about the stages, Dorothy started with that, the stages of racial awareness and how you talk to children at different stages, what's appropriate. Dr. Chaplin, you want to jump in?
Sure. I think one of the things that's really important to know is, first of all, that children do see race from a very early age. So we can have that conversation. Shifting that conversation from race to racism is really about fairness and bringing fairness in. And one of the big keys is to just know the level that the children are at. And the best way to know that is their questions. When you create an environment, the first step, I think, in creating an anti-racist classroom is to create an environment where questions are allowed, right? Where questions are okay, where children can talk about what comes up for them. And that helps get that conversation started, right? That really leads you. So the conversation is, now that we can talk about this, why is it so hard to find Band-Aids for somebody who looks like you, Rosemarie, and not so much for somebody who looks like Alyssa, right? Why is that a thing? So children are going to bring these questions up if we just provoke it in a way that it's there, it's open conversation. When that conversation comes up, we talk about, wow, that really isn't fair, is it? That is not police brutality at all. It's about the way our society is set up to center some people and to marginalize others. And if our society is set up that way, that everything is centered on white people, then other people are pushed to the edges. And that's where the conversation moves from race to racism. And is that fair? And how does that feel? Those are the same conversations we have every day with preschool children. Is that fair? And how do you think that makes him feel, right? We do this every day with our children. So to just extend it by not eliminating race as a topic of conversation, right? That it just pushes it. And as the children are older, they're exposed to more, right? They're more likely to see more on television. They're more likely to hear more. Their questions will get deeper. And that leads you to, how do we have that conversation? If you haven't opened the door by just what Alyssa did, being that vulnerable and saying, I don't know, and I didn't learn this, and I wasn't taught this, invites the conversation. Children will walk in the room, walk through the room while you're watching television and say, well, look at all the white people in that show, and walk out of the room. They've just told you exactly how aware they are, and they've invited the conversation. So it's not, okay, now we're going to sit down and have circle time and talk about police brutality. It's really when and how this comes up, right? And approaching it from how they bring you in.
Omar, would you like to jump in there?
I think sometimes we make this a more difficult subject than necessary. If you could talk about bullying, you could talk about race. If you can say the difference between right and wrong, if your child walks up on someone and take their lunch money and say, hey, that's not right. You can also say, hey, although that person may not look like you, treat them with the same respect and dignity to how you want to be treated. These are just the simple things that we can do. But sometimes for some reason, we turn race into a PhD study when it's really just the simple things that we need to start our kids off with. It's very simple. If you see someone that's different from you, that doesn't mean you're better than them. If you're looking at something on social media, you can say, hey, having your knee on someone's neck as they die on social media is wrong. You can say these things because it's in your gut. It is in your heart. So the same moral values and principles that you teach in your everyday household about chores, about how to treat your siblings, about how to treat your parents, about how to treat your grandparents, how to treat your neighbors. All you got to do is add one additional component, and that you treat people who are different from you the same way I've taught you how to have respect for these other individuals. Do not make it difficult and begin to expose them to. You got great things right here in the state of Colorado. You got several Native American communities that you can go to. You have the Black Western Museum you can go to. You have social media platforms while they're playing virtual video games. Why don't you go through a virtual museum on the civil rights movement and go through it with them and learn with them? So don't make it difficult. If anything, sometimes make it fun, make it engaging, make it a family experience, and I guarantee you, your children will benefit from it. You're on mute.
You just reminded me of the importance of adults being comfortable talking about race, because children are talking about it. And what you said is, if you're talking about bullying, someone wrote in the comments section, if you're talking about stranger danger and private body parts, that's sensitive and it can be uncomfortable. Why is race uncomfortable? Sarah, she had a question, and we can bring it up about any good language to teach young kids to address race when it comes up. And you all have touched on that. I would just like to tell a quick story about when I was visiting one of my classrooms. I was observing a student teacher. And Sarah, when you talk about having language to address issues as they come up, this was one of those where my teacher really had to stretch herself and not ignore what was happening. She happened to be reading a book, and she had a little white girl on her right, a Black girl on her left. And as she was reading, the little Black girl said, "Oh, she's beautiful." And my student teacher said, "Yes, she is." And she kept reading. And then the little Black girl said, "Oh, she's really beautiful. I wish I could be beautiful like her." And my student said, "But you are. You are beautiful." She goes, "No, I'm not, because I have brown skin." Getting back to Dorothy's point. She said, "No, I'm not, because I have brown skin." And the little white girl said, "Well, I can be beautiful because I don't have brown skin." And my teacher just froze. My student froze. I could just read her mind. Oh, Lord, and Rosemarie is right here. What am I supposed to say? What am I supposed to do? I'm going to encourage all of you to have this treasure chest of responses, Because if you don't know what you're going to say in those moments before you say them, if you're not already prepared, you'll let it go by. You'll miss the teaching opportunity. And I just watched her. I didn't take my eyes off. And I'm just telepathically, you got this, you got it, you got it. We've talked about this. She took a deep breath, closed the book, put it in her lap, and she said, yes, your skin is brown. And it is very, very beautiful. No, my skin's not brown. My skin is kind of peach. Let's put our arms together. See the difference? And then she had the white girl put hers in. She goes, and your skin is kind of pinkish. And it's beautiful, but not because it's not brown. That was very important to point out, because do you see how white supremacy was setting in even at 3 and 4 years old? And transition happened. The little black girl still wasn't convinced, but she kept telling her how beautiful she is. And then she looks at me and says, my teacher is brown like you. Her skin is brown like yours. Do you think she's beautiful? And I'm thinking, yeah, put me on the spot, right? But after that incident, she said, Dr. Allen, we talked about this in class, but I never in a million years thought I would see it. What can I do when I have my own classroom to make sure that little black girls don't feel this way in my room? And so we took a tour. We took a tour of the classroom first. There was not a single representation of a beautiful black girl anywhere, not in books, not on walls, not in play materials. And then we took a tour of the entire school. And again, nothing that represented little black girls as beautiful and smart and capable. As our panelists have said, representation is everything. So Sarah, when we talk about good language to teach young children to address race, when it comes up, you have to know. I'm going to ask our panelists to give you a couple of sentences, something you can put in your treasure chest today that you can use when this comes up in your classroom.
Well, I'll jump in. I'll jump in, and I think it's representation, right? So looking around the classroom, looking around the room, looking at the books, looking at the people in the center, but it's also how eagerly you as a teacher go there, and that's really key. So the first book that Rosemarie showed, the Cinderella story with a Black Cinderella, to take that book and open that book and say, oh, she's so beautiful. Look at how beautiful this princess is. Oh, I love her hair and her skin. To be that effusive as a teacher really gives that model to children that, well, if you think she's beautiful, maybe I should think she's beautiful. Or maybe there's a space here for me to say, but she's not white. And we can start that conversation right away. So that would be one thing I would say right off the bat, is to deliberately go to that marginalized place and put yourself in those shoes.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Very, very good example. Alyssa or Omar?
I was just going to say that, Sarah, if you have young kids in your classroom and primarily they're white, I think one of the, similarly to police brutality and some of those harder concepts, white privilege would be something that you might want to think about addressing at some point. And I think my children were reminding me that we talked about what it means to run with the wind at our back versus running against the wind. And we just sort of, that was one easy concept. Boy, it's hard to run against the wind. I feel like, oh, when the wind's at my back, things are easier and I can run faster and all of that. And I think that was one, something that my kids pointed out to me that was sort of a nice analogy to help kids start to think about what's easier for some people than it perhaps is for others and what makes it that way. And how do we start to really think about empathy and things in that regard?
Absolutely. Thank you, Alyssa.
I'm going to say that my colleagues have already talked about verbally what you say. But what about the nonverbal cues in your classroom that you started to talk about, Dr. Allen? What about if you're teaching science and you're only using examples of white scientists. Why not talk about Imhotep and Mae Jemison? Why not talk about the contributions of American Indians to literature? Why not talk about how our Mexican brothers and sisters, when we talk about agriculture, we only talk about them in the space of picking, but they have done so much with land conservation in Costa Rica, Mexico, and other places. We could actually learn from them on how to protect our environment. So it's not just what you say about race, is how you represent it in the pedagogy and the curriculum that's even more important than just talking about differences in people.
Absolutely. Absolutely. You know, I'm looking at Kristen Wheeler Highland. Her question, as we bring it up now, she tells her educators to consult with and watch for stereotypic images, especially when purchasing anti-bias or diversity materials from early childhood product companies. Omar, you touched on it. We have to represent the contributions of all people. Before we answer Kristen's question, I do just want to talk about you and your race for Aurora mayor. You ran a grassroots campaign, and you were able to garner the support of all races and all people. As a Black man who didn't have the name recognition, how did you talk about race and garner that support to the point where we had to have a runoff election against a congressman? I just want to know how you approached race in that.
Well, I have to give credit to my family, because my family said treat everybody with respect and dignity. So if I was with my Ethiopian brothers and sisters, and by the way, I hope there's some peace that come to Ethiopia as they're experiencing the civil war right now. But how do we address our Latinx community? How do we address our LGBTQ community? How do we address our unhoused community? It started out with how I said earlier. I just walk to them and treat them with respect. And I become vulnerable and say, hey, teach me about you. Teach me about your culture. It is not me to come in as the expert, and it's me to come here and be a student and learn more about you and learn more about, if I'm elected, how can I represent you in the right way? Although you may not have a large population in the city of Aurora, you still count. And so I approached every single place I visited with that same type of demeanor. And I think people realized that I was sincere about, I want to be a student more so than an elected official. And I think that was one of the reasons why we were able to garner the support that we had and able to get to that point where we almost had a successful campaign.
Absolutely. Now, some of you may be wondering, why did I ask Omar that question as we were looking at Kristen Wheeler Highland's question? Let's put that question back up, because she encourages educators to watch for stereotypical images. But how do you do that? And Omar just gave us a blueprint. He just gave it to us. He just said, you have to go to the people. When you are buying books that's representing different races, ethnicities, religions, whatever, you have to understand that you may not be the expert. You may make some mistakes and you may engage in stereotypical practices. Please, please, please stop putting basketball players and entertainers up for people of color when they are scientists and engineers and lawyers and doing amazing things. Go to the people. Ask them what they want, what their favorite books are. Ask them to look at your books and review them for stereotypes. Ask them if this book represents who they are. This is a book about Chinese Americans. Does this represent you? Right after 9/11, I had a large Afghan population. I wanted to have books for children about Islam and about Muslims praying. And there was a book called My Grandfather Prays 5 Times a Day. And I took it to my Muslim friend, Fahima. And I said, does this represent Islam? And she was able to point out some of the good and some of the bad and some of the stereotypes. And she said some of the places where they're saying he prays, we would never pray because it's not clean. But you have to practice what Omar just said, and that's practicing cultural humility, which forces you into the position of a teacher where you suspend all judgment. I like to call it the practice of not knowing. And when we engage in the practice of not knowing, then we are then the students, and we can learn more, and we can watch out for stereotypical images. And we can ask the people that we're engaging with if this is a true representation of who they are. So as we continue to go over, and as you can tell, we're going to you for the questions. And a registrant said, is there more we can do to diversify education and education opportunities, not just in early childhood, but throughout grade school years? What can we do to become more diverse?
Well, I want to say one of the things that you mentioned, Rosemarie, about going and looking at the books. It's not just the books themselves, but who wrote them, right? So that doesn't mean that you can't have a book, Snowy Day by Ezra Jack Keats in your classroom, right? Which for many years, right, in my classroom, that was the books. The Ezra Jack Keats books were the books that had a black face in them, that had black children, and those children playing. But Ezra Jack Keats is not black, right? So is he really representing the voices of those children? So Omar talked about it in terms of curriculum at a higher level. In preschool, our picture books are a lot of our curriculum and a lot of what we're working from. So remembering that our voices, right, the voices of those, that's a place to start. But just like the book that you shared, right, just because that book was written by someone from that culture doesn't necessarily mean it represents everyone. So taking that additional step, right? Early in my career, I did not have a lot of exposure to a lot of other people to share my books and say, does this represent you? Like, I was limited in who I could go to. I didn't have a Muslim friend that I could ask about that book. And so I didn't have that same opportunity. I can trust our voices, the authors from a culture, more readily than I can trust books written about others, which tend to other people. So that's a step. My next step is to expose myself, right? Expand my circles and expose myself beyond, right? And we have to ask families to do that and recognize too that being a person of color doesn't relieve us from the work of teaching anti-racism. It changes the perspective that we teach from, but it doesn't relieve us of that responsibility. So there are many of us that consider ourselves Latino, Latinx, Hispanic, Chicano, Indigenous, or Mexican. I'm Puerto Rican. That's how I identify. People identify by their country of origin. That ethnicity is another piece, and it borders on racism. We deal with coming to terms with the fact that we may not all be unified, not have ways of dealing or challenging white supremacy that align between communities of color. We may not have alignment within some communities of color, right? We have people that have internalized white supremacy and don't want to confront this or don't know how to deal with it. But all of us are dealing with racial trauma, maybe the racial trauma of the criminalization of immigration right now, right? And that can be firsthand or vicarious, right? Increased deportation and detention those are racial, ethnic traumas that some communities are dealing with. And within those communities, my experience has been a lot of internalized colorism, where the difference between the shades of people's skin really are where my biases, where I was raised, those biases, that the lighter skinned you are, the better, right? In that ranking, the better you are. And there are a lot of people in communities of color that live with that ranking and that have internalized that ranking. And they raise their children to think, well, don't be like them, right? You're better than that. And that becomes an issue, right? We have to know that we're not excused. We're not excused from teaching in an anti-racist manner simply because we're persons of color, right? Or we're from communities of color, or we're closely connected to communities of color, or we have some kind of intersectionality with those communities of color. We still have to step up our game and do that self-examination, right? And begin by educating ourselves and exposing our children. We have to stop segregating for safety, right? Segregating ourselves for safety. We have to start socializing for exposure, right? And that will transition us into, as we dig deeper for our children's sake.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Dorothy. Colorism is real. I have a question that's connected loosely to what you're talking about, and it's Christine Stone. And she's a teacher. And as we pull her question up, it says, as a teacher, I often have students making fun of other races, not necessarily in a mean way aimed at an individual. I currently use any incidents as teaching moments, but would like to hear what the panelists have to say. And as I was reading Christine's question, Dorothy, I was also thinking about colorism and what happens within groups. Because if you're working in predominantly communities of color, you may hear people in the same race talk about skin color and hair texture and things like that. So Christine would like to hear what the panelists have to say about people, students making fun of other races, even if it's not necessarily mean.
I was just gonna say that I think, Rosemarie, I'm gonna point to something that you said and to your books on hair. I think taking an opportunity to just point out differences, and this, we had this conversation with the beauty conversation as well, but to take that opportunity to get ahead of some of that, I think is a really good thing. So pointing out that people's hair is different. Some girls have long hair, some girls have short hair, some boys have long hair, some hair is I think those are the kinds of it's very factual, right? These are differences between us, and this is, but I really like that idea of using things that children just have everyday experience with to have those conversations. And I think that might be one way to preempt some of what you're talking about, Christine.
That, I read my book. For those of you who may not know, I have a series of children's books, and one of them is Stylish and Straight, about a little Black girl who's getting her hair hot combed, straightened, and the other is Cute and Curly. But I read Stylish and Straight at a school, predominantly white, and one little girl was mixed race, Black and white. And when I got to the point that says, "Please don't touch my hair," she almost stood up. She went, "Oh, teacher, teacher, teacher." And I said, "Do you have something to say?" And she goes, "Yes. Can everybody stop touching my hair?" And at the end, when I asked for questions, one little guy says, "Well, my hair is straight," little white guy, blonde hair. He goes, "My hair is straight, but my mom doesn't use a hot comb. It's just straight." And we had a whole conversation about how your hair grows out of your head, some curly, some straight. And it was a great conversation that led to not making fun of other races, but just talking about it in the way that Dr. Chaplin and Omar talked about, was in terms of difference. Just the same way we would talk about any other characteristic. Dorothy, do you have something to add to this? Oh, I saw Omar's hand up. I'm sorry, Omar.
I was just going to say that this is also an opportunity to talk about the science of those differences as well. Different regions of where people come from, their biological makeup is for them to be able to adapt in the region that they're in. This is a geology class, this is a science class, this is an anatomy physiology class, and if we're able to embed it in the curriculum and we're able to turn it into a lesson, to me, outside of just talking about differences, now we're giving them some facts and turning it into an educational opportunity that they could walk away from educating their peers.
I had the privilege of watching a 6th grade teacher talk about melanin, you know, just the science of melanin. You know, people from warmer regions, they need, their skin needed to be protected from the sun, so they have more melanin, which made them darker, and people who were from colder regions had less because they didn't need it. It was fabulous, the science of race. Dorothy, were you going to say something?
No, I was just going to say, I think the teachable moment is exactly the way to step into it, and inviting those conversations, right? And inviting those conversations. And same and different is kindergarten curriculum, right? That is what we learn in kindergarten. That's a big part of our curriculum. So really having that conversation and inviting those questions and comments, making space for that to be something that we talk about in the classroom does reduce some of that making fun of. If there's no space for it, children kind of go to the, I just heard a study the other day about the way we play, right? And the way that children play and interact with one another. And when we eliminate that, I think it was you, Rosemarie, who was telling me about this. When we eliminate that physical play, that horsing around play in the classroom, children turn it into bullying. They're not allowed to find and make those pecking orders and find that hierarchy physically. So they turn it into a verbal bullying. So one of the things that we can do is to just bring that verbal, take it away from a bullying space and bring it back into the classroom and have those conversations as a part of everyday conversations. If we're talking about it, they don't have to take it quietly and go do it on their own. That can be something that we talk about in the classroom. This isn't better or worse than that.
Thank you so much, Dorothy. I appreciate that. Penfield Tate has a question. As we bring his question up, it says, do we also need to keep teaching with our kids about all races, not just Black and white, to combat the many stereotypes in society? I'm just seeing other panelists shake their heads. Absolutely, absolutely. We are a very, very diverse community. One of the things that happened in the 80s and 90s when we began to talk about multiculturalism and diversity, we defined those terms as everything that was not white. And white people did not see themselves as cultural beings. We have to help everyone to see themselves as cultural beings and to recognize the culture they bring into every situation, because if we don't, then we only see things through our own cultural lens, and then we have a tendency to other people. I do want to point out a comment that MF made. And I love this and I want to clarify it. And she says, remember, Cinderella is a patriarchal story. It's not the narrative I want for girls. Please look beyond just changing her skin. There are some great alternatives to that sexist story too. So yes, MF, you're absolutely right. And that is not our intent. Those are just the examples of the books that we had here. Does any panelists, you want to expand on this? No? Okay.
I think it brings up a good point, because are we taking the Black face and putting it on a white narrative? Or do we have indigenous stories that are true to our culture, that are more powerful to share and be able to talk about our contributions to society? When we look at the movie Black Panther, it wasn't a makeup of any other superhero. It was about this society that is Black, that's made of scientists, that's made of doctors, made of lawyers. And it wasn't just Black people that said, hey, I want to be in Wakanda. It was white. It was Latinx. If you looked at people who wanted a Wakanda Halloween costume, it was multi-racial, multi-ethnic, multi-generation. And so I say that to say that sometimes those narratives need to come from our own communities, talk about our own stories. Aquila and the Bee is our story, not something that we've taken from somewhere else. So I understand where it's come from, but at the same time, I don't see a problem in having a Black Cinderella. I think it's both and. It's also having those cultural narratives that we own, that we wrote, and that come from our communities.
Wonderful.
As well.
Thank you so much, Omar. We have a question here from Zuten Green Mills as we bring that one up. It says, cultural responsiveness has been discussed quite a bit lately. Could you please differentiate between cultural awareness, cultural responsiveness, and cultural humility? This is a great question. Thank you so much. All right, panelists, I'm excited to hear you tackle this one.
Well, I'll say as a parent that it was a very famous person named Dr. Rosemarie Allen who told me that really we want to get past cultural responsiveness and we want to get into cultural affirmation. And so what we really want to do is support people in their full identity. And that's so true with children. That's how they get to know who they are and those about and about each other is through their identities. And I think that that's a really important point to make here, that it's not about just how we respond to different cultures, but it's also about how we help people live into that. So if you take the sort of everybody wants to play in the sandbox narrative one step further, it's not just everybody wants to play together, but it's that this sandbox isn't really a great sandbox unless we're all here together, unless we're all bringing what we each individually have and share and can value in one another. And so I sort of think about it in those ways. And I think that that's an important sort of reframe to make, is that this community requires everybody that's here. And so how do we really make that how do we live into that in all of the things that we do in our daily lives and in the lives of children?
Excellent. Thank you so much, Alyssa. Omar and Dorothy?
I'll go ahead. I think the terms themselves are distinct. To me, cultural awareness is a recognition that I have a perspective, that I have an identity, and that I understand the world from my perspective, and that other people have other perspectives. That's a simple awareness of cultural difference. I think culturally responsiveness, especially as a teacher, is about taking that next step and recognizing, because my students have a different perspective and come from a different worldview, or have different experiences than I have, that I have to approach them differently. So I don't ask the same things. I don't lower my expectations ever, but I don't ask the same things the same way, because I'm aware that their perspective is different and their experience is different and their response and reactions will be different. I think that cultural humility is going that next step that Omar talked about way in the beginning, about being aware that I don't know what I don't know, and that I can't assume that because I read this book, or I studied that, or I met this person, or I attended that function, that now I'm an expert on whatever it is that is your experience. So true cultural humility is being able to go and ask those questions and say, is this your experience? Does this reflect your culture? Am I being responsive in a way that works for you?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Omar, did you have anything to add to that?
I mean, I think it was said beautifully, and I would just take what was said and just really turn it into a 4-step process. where cultural awareness on those beginning stages of learning about the differences. Cultural responsiveness is how you take in that what you're aware of, what do you do with it next? And then cultural humility is the engagement of others from an authentic perspective. And then that cultural affirmation comes after you have had that cultural humility and all that stuff. That cultural affirmation is that now you're going to treat people as equals so that we could dismantle this culture of racism. So I look at it as a 4-step process that we probably could use in teaching in the classroom to talk about race and talk about differences.
Dr. Allen, you're muted.
You'd think I'd get that right. But this is from a registrant. My granddaughters are the only students of color in their classrooms in a Douglas County charter school. Where should conversations begin when white students ask people, or her granddaughters as well, who ask why people who demonstrated this summer after George Floyd's death? How can her granddaughters answer that? And this is a tough one. And I can sympathize with you because I live in Douglas County and my children went to Douglas County schools. So how do they answer, especially in an environment where it may not be safe?
Yeah, I think the first thing to consider is the safety,
Mhm.
right? For her grandchildren, are they in a position where they're safe? The trauma, the virtual trauma of them being aware of these things is real, and their exposure is real, and the risk to them is real. So safety comes first. So my response, if these were my children, the first thing that I would say that their answer should be is, I didn't protest. I don't know. Right. So to step away from it, that's how you get away from that conversation, is to say that that wasn't me. Right. This isn't my experience. So I can't tell you what they were thinking. And the safer that they feel and the more comfortable it is, I'm always concerned about the trauma impacts, right? And the risk to those children. So I would give them the tools to be able to get away from that conversation and to avoid that conversation if they need to. If their children, depending on the age of her grandchildren, and their readiness and their willingness to step up and speak, they would again be speaking either from, I attended the rallies and this is why, or I participated in protests and this, or my family participated in protests and this is why, or from what I understand of people who did, this is what I'm hearing is the reasons why, rather than to ask them, which happens in Douglas County or in schools that are predominantly white. It happens a lot that those children are then asked to speak up for, represent, and defend the actions of every one of their ethnicity or race or background. And they shouldn't be put in that position as children unless they feel ready and willing to take it on and to fight that battle.
Dorothy, thank you so much for that, because that was the experience of my children as well. They were called upon to represent the entire race, and the burden of that is too much. For educators on this call, please be aware of your responsibility to protect children of color from this burden of representing the entire race, from their classmates, from fellow teachers, and even from you as a teacher. If you're talking about something that is race or ethnic or language specific, don't call on the only child of color in your classroom to represent their race for that. Omar, it looks like you had something to add to that one.
This is a tough one because I'm a fighter in my heart. and I'm hearing this is it's tough because on one end, we talk about the abolitionist movement. We talk about civil rights in the history class. We talk about World War II. We talk about World War I. We even talk about the Civil War, and we talk about the Revolutionary War in which this country was founded on. So why not can the child of color say, hey, the same reasons why these people stood up against Hitler, why these people stood up against the British so that they could become an independent country, how come these kids of color cannot say, hey, these were people who were standing up for their First Amendment rights because they saw something that was wrong, because that is the history and the foundation of our country. How come we cannot arm them to say that with affirmation and not have to be fearful of either being suspended or expelled or being harmed?
Very powerful.
So to me, if we're going to talk about how America stood up for what was right, and they're able to be proud to celebrate all these different holidays for standing up for these causes, why can't this child of color say, hey, police brutality is a bad part of America, and that these people who were out there protesting were standing up for those who didn't have a voice? I think it's fair for them to say that. And I think they should be protected when they say it. And I think they should be educated on how to say it. And it's also a both and. Because as my good friend has said, there are some places where they're not safe. And they have to be able to judge when to come back and have that conversation when it's safer, or when to be able to say it in a way where you're teaching someone and not talking at them, so that you both can have that educational moment.
Excellent. Excellent, Omar. Thank you. And I love the way that we're balancing this out. And it really takes me to a question of another registrant. Is that how she recently moved to a small and unincorporated community. Her son is only a year, but in a few short years will attend a school that'll be 99% white Protestant Christian. How can this mom help her child to understand diversity in an environment where he's not likely to encounter anyone of a different race other than or religion? And how can I help him to learn that there's more than this rural American red mentality that will be fed and the implicit bias that goes with it? And this gets to what you were saying, Omar. How do we prepare children with the emotional strength and the skills to stand up, even if they have to stand alone for what's right? How do we prepare them for that?
Jump in again. I think one thing that's important in this is that we are a very, very global society, especially right now. So we may be quarantined and trapped in our homes, but we are exposed to the whole world, right? So television, internet, we have access to everything and everyone and everywhere. So exposure is not just because in your community or just because in your school, there are limited people to expose yourself to. That doesn't mean that you cannot expose yourself to more, right? So it's about stretching outside, using the tools that are available, and providing that support, like you're saying, that preparation through conversation. So watching a sporting event on television and talking about, look at the audience. Who do you see in the audience? Who is not in the audience? Who do you notice attends this particular kind of sport? Who participates in this particular kind of sport? Why do you suppose that is? Those conversations open up the door to that exposure that get children to look at things differently. So to watch television or to watch a podcast or to watch YouTube videos with a child and just guide them in that critical analysis of who does that represent? Who does that not represent? Who's here? Who's not here? Why do you suppose that is? Invites that. So if a student is going to be in a school that isn't going to be exposing them to a lot of things, then the responsibility becomes even greater to expose them to more from in the ways that you can.
Absolutely. As we begin to wrap up, I do want to share some of the books that I have outlined here. And Dorothy gets just to what you were talking about in terms of exposure. There's an organization that produces these books. It's the Black Americans of Achievement, and raising Black children in a predominantly white Douglas County School District, I had to take on the responsibility of educating my children. So this is the director is the W.E.B. Du Bois Institute for African American Research at Harvard University. So they have books on just about everyone from Paul Robeson, Booker T, Zora Neale Hurston, Coretta Scott King, Malcolm X. Here, The Anti-Racist Baby is a great book. This is an amazing book. Not only is it a book to talk to kids about racism, but they email you every week with little strategies and tips to talk to children about racism. White Socks Only talks about segregation, and you can use this book to also bridge what happened then to what's happening now. Familiarize yourself with white spaces. Although we don't have signs up that says colored and white anymore, the reality is still there. The Kwanzaa story. We're talking about Christmas. Are we talking about Hanukkah, Ramadan, and Kwanzaa right now? You can expose children to so many things that's outside of their own circles. And as you're exposing children to books, expose yourself. I have an assignment. You know, we're professors here, so you're going to get one. I want you to take a look at your Facebook page, your Twitter account, and your, can't think of the third one. Starts with an I, Instagram. Your Instagram account. I want you to take a look at it, and I want you to notice who your friends are. What does your social network look like? Dorothy, I see you jumping in there. Go ahead.
I want to go a step further, Rosemarie, and I want to say, look at your LinkedIn. Who are your connections, and who do you have opportunities for?
Yes.
Right? So who are you connected to, and who are you exposing those, giving opportunities to? That's business, right?
Absolutely. Look at it. Expand your reality. You cannot expand children's if you don't expand your own. So I just want to take this time. I knew we would get through this really fast. I want to thank my esteemed panelists, Dr. Alyssa Brouch, Dr. Dorothy Chaplin, my good friend and my heart, Mr. Omar Montgomery. Thank you for sharing your experience, your expertise, and your time with us. It is so important for us as adults to be very comfortable talking to children about race, because in doing so, we prepare them to live in a racial society. And in each of our classrooms and in our homes, our future doctors, activists, lawyers, judges, police, how they treat other people is going to depend on what we teach them today. So at this time, I'm going to turn it back over to Adrienne Miller, who will provide announcements. You're muted, Adrienne.
All right. Sorry about that. Well, thank you, Dr. Allen, panelists, for sharing your thoughts and knowledge about how to better understand the legacy of race in America. Thanks also to the audience and all of the audience members who posted questions. We really appreciated that. Now, we weren't able to get to all of the questions this evening, but you can continue the conversation online in our Legacy of Race Facebook group and at future programs. Our next program will be in January, so if you haven't already registered on the Colorado Humanities website at coloradohumanities.org, please do so. So you can explore the resources we have on this topic, and you can keep up and get updates on our next program and how you can continue to be a part of the conversation. Thank you again to our sponsors and partners. Please join us for the rest of this series. Good evening and happy holidays.